exposed. And what that means is that when we pour epoxy in above here, like I did on this motor here, that epoxy will harden and form a ring that will retain the flange to prevent it from being extruded or pushed out by the pressure of the inside of the chamber. So we're going to want to insert this a certain distance once the fuel is in. Complicating that is the fact that when we form a fuel grain, we want that inner hole. And it turns out for this particular application, these epoxy mixing nozzles, I've got everything related to epoxy, are just about the right diameter and length for this particular size motor. And so when I've got the warm and soft fuel in there, I'm going to insert this into the center of the fuel, creating that central port. And then when I pull this out, I'm going to end up with a nice fuel grain. But what that's going to do when it goes into the fuel, it's going to raise the level. Now I've calculated this out, and you can do that yourself depending on what type of core you're going to make. But it will raise the level of the fuel, and you need the level of the fuel still to be low enough that you're going to get about half of the nozzle retained inside of the end of the chamber. So it's a little bit of paperwork math for any particular engine. But when you put everything together, you can calculate a distance. And when you come up with that particular distance, you can take some of these paper liners that are available from rocket motor parts and draw a line. I've got this little dotted pencil line that represents how far I'm going to insert this into here in order that when the fuel rises, I end up with a depth of penetration of the nozzle that's just right to retain it at the right level. So I use this to measure how high I should fill this with fuel. And I also use this as a way to keep the outside clean so that when I want to put the epoxy in there, I'm not gluing fuel also, and it keeps it possible to put it in the nozzle. So now the next thing we need to do is we need to end up building or making the fuel. So let's get on to the chemistry, because that's really the fun part. A sugar rocket, classically, the type that King of Random made years ago, is based on table sugar, sucrose, mixed in with potassium nitrate or stump remover or saltpeter. And the optimal ratio, as we talk about in a lot of our chemistry videos, is the stoichiometric mix, which means just enough oxidizer, just enough fuel. We burn all the fuel, we don't have anything left over, we get the most amount of energy per gram out of the total mixture. That stoichiometric mixture is about 3 parts oxidizer by weight and 1 part sugar or organic compound by weight. Problem is, you can't get that much of the solid salt oxidizer into the sugar to form anything other than something that's like plaster. As you drop it down to what is generally considered to be the optimal mix, which is 65 parts to 35 parts, roughly 2/3, 2 parts to 1 part, you're almost as good as the stoichiometric mix in terms of total output, but it's much easier to blend it. And that's the ratio we're going to use. So when we make up 100 grams of fuel mix for this particular rocket, we're going to use basically 65 parts of oxidizer and 35 parts of sugar. Now, in order to make a sugar rocket, because sucrose melts at a very high temperature and tends to burn, you do it based on what's called the recrystallization process. You take water, doesn't matter how much you want to use, you use water, and you'll put the oxidizer and the sugar together into the pan, and you'll mix them up. You're making a candy. The water, by dissolving the compounds, gets the 2 particles very close together, and as you heat it and you're cooking off the water, it becomes thicker and thicker and thicker. It's like you're making candy. The end result, though, is still very thick, and you have to get to some pretty high temperatures to drive off enough of the water that it doesn't interfere with the performance of the fuel. There is a better material to use for sugar rockets than sucrose, and it's based on a sugar alcohol called sorbitol. This is a food product. You can get this for health food, and it's actually a sweetener that doesn't have any calories. Your gut can't digest it. So it tastes sweet, but you won't get any calories from it. If you have a little bit, it can make your food